Small-scale renewable energy for electrification in rural Nicaragua. I spent 10 weeks this summer traveling within and between rural areas of Nicaragua, trying to answer a deceptively simple question. What causes some of these projects to succeed while others fail? The information provided in this video is largely what I learned during that time, but is informed by the literature on appropriate energy, community development, and Nicaraguan history. Renewable energy is defined as energy which derives from an infinite source. These are typically categorized by 5 sources: solar, wind, water, geothermal, and biomass. There are others, but the technologies most used for electrification in Nicaragua are solar and microhydro. Nicaragua has a wealth of natural resources, including volcanoes, rivers, strong winds, lots of coastline, which give it the possibility for mega projects, like the Amayo Wind Project in Rivas and Tumarin in Ras. For those of you who are not familiar with energy metrics, keep in mind that your typical toaster uses about 1,200 watts, or 1.2 kilowatts. Many small projects produce less than 20 kilowatts. Mega projects typically generate upward of 1,000,000 watts, or 1 megawatt. For example, the 22 turbines in the Amayo Wind Project generates 44 megawatts, 7% of Nicaragua's demand, and Tumarin is expected to generate 253 megawatts, or 30% of the national demand. With these impressive numbers, why focus on small scale for Nicaragua? First, you need to understand that Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. This is due to many factors, a few of which are explained by Professor Laura Enriquez, author and sociology professor at UC Berkeley.
I would start out with the long history of the Nicaraguan economy being dependent on the export of a few key products, and those products being such that they're subject to huge vacillations in the price in the international economy. That Nicaragua had a long history of dictatorship, and I'm thinking particularly of the Somoza regime. Huge expenditures, a diversion of a large part of the national budget to the military. And so if you look at countries where there's a huge investment in military versus countries where there's a smaller investment in military, well, if you have a smaller investment in the military sector, you've got more resources to go into things like education and healthcare and things like that. Right? And Nicaragua has a long history of having major investments in military. On top of that, I would point out the war and the impact of the war and the U.S. economic blockade that became an embargo that affected the relationship between Nicaragua and the U.S. The U.S. had been Nicaragua's principal trade partner, but the blockade affected more than just trade relations between the U.S. and Nicaragua, but was extended to the international lending community, as well as the U.S. put pressure on other countries to not engage in certain kinds of trade with Nicaragua. And the war itself had a tremendous impact on the development prospects of Nicaragua. Post the 1980s, structural adjustment has had a major impact on what has been possible what forms it's been possible for development to take. So the emphasis then became, once again on opening up the economy to the international market, and anything that was for export was great, and anything that was for domestic consumption would not receive any support from the state.
This is complicated by what Gary Rushbarger calls a culture of poverty.
Well, it's a combination of the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, and now they have all these bad habits. I'm numbering them. I have like 46 bad habits that I list that they have, from not keeping their word to being punctual to not being very passive, forgetful, on and on and on. And this I call it's part of a culture of poverty. There's no doubt. Well, anybody who's there for some years that sees this. And you know what's interesting? I'm a Marxist, so I look at things in terms of class. Almost all these habits are cross-class lines.
Now let's fast forward a little into more recent history to understand the push toward widespread renewable energy. In 2006, even the electrified parts of Nicaragua were suffering from 6 to 10 hour blackouts every day. This faulty system created social unrest, which would have to be solved by creating a more secure production and distribution of electricity.
Lo único que nosotros estamos aburridos que el gobierno no haga nada por el pueblo.
Imágenes como estas son las que don Porfirio Rivera no quisiera volver a vivir. Los apagones hace 4 años eran obligados debido a la poca generación eléctrica en el país.
Y cuando no lograba vender el pollo que compraba en el día, lo dejaba aquí, amanecía hecho agua y prácticamente venía a hacer el cuadro.
Don Porfirio describe una realidad que afectó a moros y cristianos.
Por ejemplo, yo ponía una cama de hielo aquí abajo, encima el producto, para que ese rato que no había luz, me lo mantuviera. Aparte que teníamos que comprar el hielo, que esa es inversión aparte, teníamos que pagar el recibo de luz.
Since then, the grid has grown exponentially, largely eliminating the daily blackouts. To do so, it has focused much of its attention on renewables to fill this demand.
In the last 6 years, allowed increase in the electrification ratio to 72%, mostly benefiting hundreds of thousands of rural families.
4 años después, el país cuenta con una capacidad instalada que garantiza la demanda.
Si llegamos a incrementar mayor energía renovable, reducir las pérdidas de manera sustancial para hacer el sector viable y dar cobertura a mayor cantidad de nicaragüenses, yo creo que el sector es un modelo para Centroamérica y para el mundo.
Para este año se ha logrado generar energía hasta un 46% de la demanda, basado en fuentes hidroeléctricas y eólicas. Expertos coinciden que el cambio de matriz también apunta a una energía más barata.
Si hay bajas de costos de producción, tendrá que bajar el costo al consumidor, incluyendo, comenzando con el consumo de energía eléctrica. Tiene que bajar el kilowatt hora.
El depender del búnker con los precios del petróleo ahorita nos pone en una desventaja en relación a muchos países de Centroamérica. Y definitivamente cambiar esa matriz te va a dar una estabilidad en los precios que sí, definitivamente te debe de ayudar.
Si no tuviéramos esta generación con recursos renovables como la que tenemos, el peso que tendría ahorita la generación con el petróleo sería mucho mayor y probablemente estaríamos hablando de ajustes mayores en lo que es la tarifa. Pues. Estamos claros, el hecho de que hayamos incrementado la generación con recursos renovables y que la estemos incrementando, entonces disminuye el peso de la producción con recursos de hidrocarburos, porque acuérdense que también la demanda aumenta.
Even with these large investments and projections, the rural sector remains largely unreached by the national grid. This is where small-scale renewable energy becomes more important than mega projects. In providing this electricity, they provide different economic, social, and environmental benefits.
Bueno, antes no teníamos energías, no podíamos tenerla aquí en la comunidad. La manera de conseguir la energía era simplemente por baterías de carros. Las traíamos, las cargábamos y con eso mirábamos televisión o encendíamos una lámpara.
Vengo a prender luz.
I use a candlelight so that I have light to make the dinner.
Para hacer la cena.
And the problem that this causes is that they can suddenly go out and this can cause us to injure ourselves. Another problem is that sometimes the children touch the flames and they can burn themselves. I think the only way to change this situation will be to have a solar system, and then everything will be easier.
Economically, it is not yet possible for the national government to extend its grid into the rural countryside. In feasibility studies, the cost-benefit analysis requires a degree of population density to justify the high cost of installing electric lines to rural villages. In many cases, the population density is not sufficient to justify the cost. Locally generated electricity bypasses the upfront cost because the origin of the electric supply is closer than the national grid.
So back in the 80s, the idea was not about, to my knowledge, it was not so much about substituting for oil. It was about how on earth can we get electricity to these really isolated rural communities where it's not the least bit feasible to have the national grid reach them. And so we need to look for alternative means to bring electricity to these rural communities.
Most people would prefer to have a solar system rather than kerosene lamp. What I like most is seeing people's happy faces when the solar energy system is installed. It will be very expensive to bring grid electricity here, to a place like this. It is too far, so the best solution is a solar panel.
Unlike the United States, there's thousands and thousands of people, probably millions of people living here that don't have access to electricity at all.
Solar energy is just a really practical way to meet the electricity needs in Nicaragua. They have a great solar resource. It's something that people can, just by living with it, they understand it inherently, that when there's more sun, they have more power to use, and when there's not, they need to be a little bit more conservative.
These decentralized technologies bring social benefits related to energy access, which would otherwise go unfulfilled in these rural populations. There is a direct relationship between electrical access and the placement of a nation on the Human Development Index, which is a metric for human well-being derived from different factors like life expectancy, income, and education. This relationship makes energy access central to the achievement of the first 7 Millennium Development Goals. For example, the first Millennium Development Goal is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Renewables can power appliances to provide economic opportunity as well as machinery to increase agricultural productivity or add value to the raw goods, such as coolers or refrigerators.
Whether it's charging a mobile phone, powering a washing machine, satellite dish or freezer, this town is enjoying the benefits of modern technology, all powered by sustainable, clean electricity from the sun.
I was first impacted in Africa, where I was living in a community as a teacher in the Peace Corps, and electricity came to this rural community. And then when this grid extension happened, seeing how certain people within the community really took advantage of that. Entrepreneurs that had some capital immediately set up, enhanced the businesses that they had, created new businesses like grinder for the local millet. Local priorities, electricity wasn't always on, and oftentimes it was access to income.
So with the 2 to 3 kilowatts that this generates, how many households does it power?
Here in the community we're connected to about 29 houses, so it's about 100 watts per house is what they use for electricity.
Aquí lo ha ayudado bastante la energía porque antes despulpábamos el café a mano. A veces pues llegábamos bastante noche, a veces desde como las 3 de la tarde, a veces hasta las 10 de la noche. Y ahora pues en una media hora.
The second Millennium Development Goal is to achieve universal primary education. Electrification provides light to study by at night, giving students more time to work on their homework and giving the opportunities to adults returning from the field in the evening. The third Millennium Development Goal is to promote gender equality and empower women. many of these organizations which work to install these renewable energy understand the importance of this, so they explicitly include more women in their development projects.
Very few of them had even second or third grade education. But the women who are working with the solar cookers have ended up making that the heart of what has grown this community.
Teníamos como mujeres hacer algo para las mujeres. Esa es la idea de nosotros. Quiero un futuro de las mujeres solares, que sigamos adelante trabajando con la energía del sol. La sostenibilidad es un proceso y nosotros queremos alcanzar esa.
Substituting otherwise polluting contaminants, such as diesel and kerosene, renewables serve a local health benefit by reducing respiratory infections, which in part helps the fourth goal of reducing child mortality, and the fifth goal of improving maternal health. It also provides refrigeration for vaccines to combat many diseases, which is the sixth goal. Renewables can power projects to improve health, such as using a solar pump to pipe water to individual homes.
We had our doubts that these apparatus would create the energy we needed to pump the water. But when we saw it working, we felt happy and relieved. She used to carry it in a bucket on top of her head and bring it to the kitchen. Now we have it here.
Por el beneficio del agua, hemos tenido una reducción de enfermedades.
Because of the better water, we've seen reduced incidences of diarrhea and vomiting.
Solar panels have also been installed to power rural health centers.
Before the solar panels were installed here, we didn't have a fridge because there is no grid electricity in this community. Now we can have vaccines here permanently because we have a place to store them. This means we can keep children up to date with their vaccines. There is nothing we cannot do because of the lack of energy.
The solar panels are more than just electricity. Solar panels means bringing help to communities where they have a lot of poverty.
Lastly, it completes a larger global service by reducing the carbon output of electric generation, which works towards the 7th Millennium Development Goal of ensuring environmental sustainability. Unlike larger projects, small-scale projects are not as damaging to the physical and social landscape. The problem with mega-hydro infrastructure include displacement of local peoples, environmental effects caused by the construction of a dam, including the carbon impact of the concrete used, ecological changes due to the reservoir, including a change in the flow of water, an increase in sediment, etc.
Ay, qué alma tan infeliz la del que arranca selvas, los colores del mundo, la guitarra y la pena, la alegría y la pena, el querer más profundo, como el amor que es música en el alma, como el querer oxígeno al espíritu, como el amor que es música en el alma, como el querer oxígeno al espíritu. Arale, arale, arale.
Up the stream we built a dam and we're diverting the water. And so, as you know, there's always water. It's a renewable resource. So the water is channeled through pipes, spins the turbine, which generates electricity and goes to the community. And then the water re-enters the stream farther down.
As you can see, microhydro projects are relatively non-invasive. Also, many of these projects are coupled with watershed preservation programs in order to protect the water system, which conserves the local environment and raises local awareness of the ecological interconnectedness.
Since 2007, only through the development of small hydro and solar panel installations, some 55,000 families have access to electricity.
If small-scale renewable energy projects can provide these social benefits at a lower economic cost while also being less intensive on the environment, then why is it not being used in every village in Nicaragua? Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, so the economic barriers to national implementation are enough to stop many national efforts to electrify rural areas. The initiative to do so, therefore, largely comes from non-governmental third parties, such as Nicaraguan cooperatives, international nonprofits, national nonprofits, or private business. All these work towards electrification, but their scope is relatively limited by their resources, and even further constrained by their capacity, knowledge, and donor expectations. To implement these solar or microhydro projects, many of these organizations use community participation in a variety of forms. In most cases, a council is selected from the participating community members who are on site to assure the maintenance of the communal system. Sometimes a community will organize around a renewable energy effort collectively. Other times, implementation requires a strong central figure to delegate tasks or to push a local council to remain accountable to their responsibilities to continue maintenance.
Yeah, the thing with electricity and electrification is that the realities vary so much from community to community, so much from household to household, whether you're talking about individual solar home systems or a microgrid. So it's kind of this clash of modernization, often embraced by and desired by the younger generations, as well as a felt of feelings of loss and wanting to reclaim maybe what was unique and individual and part of their identity of these different surviving indigenous communities.
One of the central themes of Blue Energy is the local production of our wind turbines here in Nicaragua at our production facility on the Inatec campus. And the reason that we do produce these locally versus importing wind turbines from China to the United States is because we're trying to build the local capacity in this region for renewable energy. And that means being able to produce, being able to operate, being able to maintain these systems beyond installation. And the philosophy is if they're able to build it, they're able to fix it.
After the systems are already installed, we teach them, me and the engineers, how to do the maintenance, because the whole idea is to make the system self-sustainable and teach the community how to do the maintenance. It's an important part of that.
For us, maintenance and training is a very key part for the system being successful, not just going and installing it and leaving. We give trainings during the solar installation. We go out and we meet with the community beforehand to prep them so they understand how they'll be involved before, during, and after the system is there.
Tenemos que cuidarlo, no que caigan cosas arriba del techo de donde está el panel solar, porque él es de vidrio y se quiebra. Que los niños no jueguen pelota, porque si cae una pelota ahí, un jonrón, se quiebra.
So how do these projects fit into the current geopolitics of Nicaragua? International influence in Nicaragua has both hindered national development, as was seen in the U.S. intervention in the Contra War, as well as benefited Nicaragua, as shown through trade partnerships and global efforts for more sustainable energy production. Many of the organizations I visited this summer had varying degrees of international involvement, either administration from the U.S., volunteers from North America and Europe, or receiving aid through international organizations wanting to move away from petroleum. The push for renewables is motivated by a variety of factors, including the Contra War.
Vladimir was motivated to start Technosol after doing military service in isolated parts of the country.
I saw what a sad thing it is not to have electricity. And then I had the opportunity to use a small solar panel, and that was when I started to get excited about solar.
Using solar to replace traditional fuels is also important since global warming is going to disproportionately affect poorer countries. It becomes a measure of self-preservation that Nicaragua would divest from fossil fuels by leapfrogging into renewables, avoiding the environmental problems associated with these, as well as the volatility of peak oil prices.
Similar to what's happened here with the telephones, where many communities never had telephones, and then they went right to cell phones. They just skipped right over the landline. We believe that you could do the same thing with electricity. You don't need to first use fossil fuel electricity and then swap it out and put solar panels on, feed it back into the grid. You can start right with solar electricity or right with hydroelectricity or wind, and be using clean energy from the beginning.
This is particularly pertinent with the recent death of Hugo Chavez. For the last 7 years, Nicaragua has received subsidized oil from this partnership with Venezuela through the alliance of Petrocaribe, a product of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. So how has Nicaragua benefited from this relationship with Venezuela, subsidized by petrodollars?
The concessional terms, not prices, the concessional terms on which Nicaragua receives oil from Venezuela mean that there's a huge influx of this resource that Nicaragua can actually resell and use the earnings from that in a whole variety of ways that it so chooses. So this is just a really tremendous asset. Well, there's been a huge discussion within Nicaragua about this in the sense that it is not being channeled through government coffers, that there is no accounting for the uses, it's not as if there's any open discussion of the uses that the resources that come from this oil will be put to, general oversight of the books that are being kept on this, as there are of all other aspects of the government budget. Given that there is no general oversight of this, and the funds are all being channeled through Sandinista affiliated organizations, is it fair that repayment of these concessional, effectively loans, then have to be paid by the government budget and the population as a whole? So there's no transparency in how the funds are being used, but the general population has to take responsibility for paying them back when the time comes. So that's a big issue.
The question then becomes, will the change of power in Venezuela affect the relationship Nicaragua has to Petrocaribe?
Let me just say, that's the million-dollar question. In theory, while the PSUV is in power in Venezuela, one would assume that the ALBA and Petrocaribe will continue to function as they have. But should they lose power, and there are elections on a regular basis in Venezuela, who's to say? It's all up for grabs.
Within the last few months of 2013, Nicaragua has become embroiled in some marine territory disputes with Colombia and others with Costa Rica, which is punctuated by the possibility of crude oil beneath the seafloor. Shifting to a renewable platform could avoid the contentious issues inherent to the property, distribution, and control of oil. By switching to renewables now, Nicaragua can be a model for other countries looking for a greener matrix. With support from the Sustainable Energy for All movement, and with the new emphasis which international financial institutions have put on renewables, Nicaragua can push towards its goal of 85% renewable energy by 2020. This will also help them when the Central American Electrical Interconnection System, CEPAC, is established, making Nicaragua an exemplar of energy development for the upcoming century.
Vamos a ser capaces incluso de exportar energía.
The CPAC transmission line will also be running through Nicaragua in a matter of years. That will open the doors to exporting generation, whether it be wind power or any other type of power generation to the rest of the region.
This is all very optimistic, but what does it actually look like in practice? Some of this is corruption.
The negative side of the Nicaraguan culture, the corruption, the dishonesty, the people not keeping their word, the people not being organized. And the Sandinistas haven't changed. If anything, gotten worse. But I can't deal with when Sandinistas stole from their own people. That was very common.
Are apathetic about politics, and they are cynical about politics because they feel like they've heard a lot of promises that have not been fulfilled, and they've also learned that politicians who promised many things then absconded with funds, etc. People don't anticipate, or rather they presume that any proposals that are put out there in the political sphere aren't going to come to anything anyway, so why bother? I mean, there basically is a lot of not only cynicism but apathy, and apathy can kill many a project, many an effort. Corruption was totally rampant under the Somoza dictatorship, so that was 3 periods of Somoza governing by 3 different members of the Somoza family, but corruption has been present even post the Somoza dictatorship. Corruption is an issue now as well, however, and that does have an impact on development prospects for the future.
Other barriers include the disproportionate effects of the different interests being heard at different parts of the project timeline.
But so oftentimes the model is use of short timelines for big budgets from major funders that really limit the capabilities for organizations to take a more holistic approach.
For a simplified example, consider community influence is most strongly felt upon the development project in the initial, largely unpaid diagnostic phase. The donors have veto power throughout the project, and these third-party intermediaries attempt to bridge the set of priorities between the 2 culturally disparate groups. In this way, there is a definite cultural bias which gets transmitted through a renewable energy project. This is one of the ways which a technology becomes politicized. Development is not neutral.
Come in with a description based on oftentimes what they perceive. So they come in and they either do some participatory work where they reveals information about the users, what their preferences are, and then from that they might design a model of trying to understand, oh, these are the needs of the community or the preferences of the community, let's present them with an option or something. And then communication of preferences from the community to the organization. The other is from the organization to the community members of what is actually going to be the results of whatever product. But then oftentimes many of these projects are abandoned because reality turns out to be much different. It takes more work than they thought it would be. Maybe their lighting product isn't producing the light that they would hope it would be. Two-way communication, I think, naturally arises when an organization is invested long-term within a community, and projects are tried, they fail, there's learning on both sides, so information is revealed over time with project failures and successes.
This becomes even more complicated once you take into consideration the responsibilities of the regional government, university, and international participants. Of course, each case is going to be affected by its isolated situation, but the development project is a largely cross-cultural experiment, and the effectiveness of this communication of priorities and abilities will ultimately affect the outcome of the project. Some commonalities in successful projects in Nicaragua include a large time investment made by the third party, the training of local people for continued maintenance on the technology, a solid form of community participation and buy-in, an established sense of trust and assurance from all parties, and the contextualization of these ideas to their different models of community development. To conclude, effective small-scale renewable energy projects for rural electrification serve to mitigate local environmental problems caused by deforestation and climate change by instilling a sense of value in the local natural resources, educating local people on watershed preservation, and proactively leapfrogging away from otherwise harmful technology. They mitigate some of the national economic problems caused by large inequities in wealth by decreasing Nicaragua's vulnerability of primary sector goods on the international market while moving them away from problematic dependencies on oil. If tied to economic productivity, electrification limits migration and provides the opportunity to use household appliances for cooking or entertainment. These create local jobs and reduce health costs due to indoor air pollution. Also, this burgeoning field attracts foreign capital looking to improve international relations or companies looking to invest in green technology. These projects mitigate social problems caused by rural isolation and a lack of infrastructure, providing education and professional job training. Many community members reported feeling happier since the lights were put in, with more entertainment from their televisions and more communication from their cell phones. In the end, the question remains, if renewable energy is so promising, what is needed for it to be effectively implemented in Nicaragua?
So you have to take a holistic approach to how you work with these communities so that you can, yes, focus on certain activities like Blue Energy focuses on energy and water, for example, but you have to also help facilitate the creation of these other services so that it all works together.
And our education system, the paradigm of classroom-based education, I think it's based on competition, based on standard curriculum design in a non-local context. I think it's not going to, can't do a good job. It doesn't do a good job, and we end up with behaving in a way that's dictated by the capitalist system, our economic system, which doesn't value a lot of these using things in a sustainable manner. So then we have to introduce regulations to get people to behave in a certain way.
This will require cross-cultural communication and education in all sectors, an increase in economic investment, and policy changes on the national level to assure the social benefit for many more rural Nicaraguans. Renewable technology is not neutral. It has been politicized by its history and the role it plays within the development project. Many of these organizations which use small-scale renewables for electrification recognize this power disparity and compensate for this inequality by using community participation for their implementation. Despite working closely with these rural communities, there are barriers to successful and sustainable implementation, but the time to push forward with these projects is now.
Renewable should be pursued as a development strategy. If that development strategy is created through a participatory process where the community members, the proposed beneficiaries, are cognizant of the costs and benefits of the process.
When I was in Nueva Segovia, a northern municipality in the country, I asked my cab driver what he thought about renewable energy. A relatively young man, calloused hands and a big smile, he says over his shoulder, "It's important, but we had other things on our mind in my day. We had to fight the war. We had to survive. Now I teach my kids about preserving the forest because I know it's important, and theirs is the first generation to be able to do something about it." While renewable energy has been around Nicaragua since the Somoza years, the new millennium marks the first opportunity it has to extending electrical generation to its most rural areas. As the effects of global climate change will disproportionately affect the people within its borders, Nicaragua has the economic stability and the favor of the international community to set an example with a green grid matrix.
Podemos decir que dentro de 4 o 5 años nuestro país va a estar casi cerca del 90% generando con recursos naturales y apenas un 10% de petróleo, cosa que ahorita no lo tenemos así.
The time is now to shift to renewables, and non-governmental organizations organizing small-scale projects that encourage community participation have played an important role in facilitating this technological adoption, which brings with it environmental, economic, and social benefits.
antes de hacer un proyecto tenemos una relación con las comunidades y a veces esa relación con las comunidades o la necesidad o la solicitud que ellos hacen crean en mí como un compromiso. A veces he pensado que yo no me puedo retirar de estos proyectos aunque encuentre un mejor trabajo o otra oportunidad, porque dejo a las familias y a las comunidades sin un apoyo.
Arare, arare, el alma y sembraré un canto, cantaré una esperanza. Arare, arare, el alma y sembraré auroras, cantaré el horizonte. Hay el sentir, el querer, el soñar no se toca, lo mejor no se toca, lo más grande en la vida. Y cuando me pides tocar la canción, ¿cómo haría? No hay canción que se toque, son invisibles, son intocables, son intangibles. Como el amor, que es música en el alma, como el querer, oxígeno al espíritu. Como el amor, que es música en el alma, como el querer, oxígeno al espíritu. Arare, 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 el desierto y sembraré un bosque, llenaré agua de llanto del mundo. Ay, qué alma tan infeliz la del que arranca selvas, los